Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. October in Tennessee usually means perfect camping weather, and that's exactly what me and Kayla were counting on. We were both 24, grinding away at our desk jobs in Nashville. She was at a marketing firm downtown, and I was doing data entry for a medical billing company. The kind of work that makes you stare at the clock every 5 minutes, wondering how it's only Tuesday. We'd been texting each other camping spots for weeks, sending links to different trails during our lunch breaks, until we finally settled on this remote area in the Cherokee National Forest. Kayla and I had been friends since middle school, the type who could spend hours together without saying a word and still have a good time. We weren't hardcore outdoorsy types or anything, just two people who needed trees instead of traffic, stars instead of streetlights, and the sound of wind through leaves instead of our bosses asking for status updates. The plan was simple: drive out Friday morning, hike to a clearing we'd found on some camping forum, spend 2 nights under the stars, and come back Sunday feeling like actual human beings again. My old Subaru Outback was packed to the ceiling with our tent, sleeping bags, a cooler full of food, and probably way more gear than 2 people needed for a weekend trip. The drive out took about 3 hours from Nashville, the last 40 minutes on this narrow gravel road that had my car groaning with every pothole. We pulled into the trailhead parking area around noon, and I remember feeling this wave of relief when we saw it was completely empty. No other cars, no voices echoing through the trees, just us and miles of forest. The trail to our camping spot was marked with faded blue blazes on the trees, supposedly 3 miles to a clearing that previous campers had described as secluded paradise. Kayla brought this old film camera she'd found at Goodwill, and she kept making me stop so she could photograph these enormous oak trees with bark so deeply grooved it looked prehistoric. The forest felt alive in all the right ways. Birds having full conversations above us, chipmunks darting across the trail, and this steady breeze that made the whole canopy sway like it was breathing. After about 2 hours of hiking, our packs digging into our shoulders and sweat staining our shirts, we finally emerged into the clearing. It was exactly what the forum had promised: a flat, open space about the size of a basketball court, surrounded by towering pines with an old fire ring made from gathered stones, and a massive fallen tree that would work perfectly as a bench. We dropped our packs and just stood there for a minute, breathing in that thick forest air, feeling like we'd found exactly what we'd been searching for. Setting up camp took us about an hour, mostly because Kayla insisted on finding the perfect angle for the tent so we'd wake up with sunlight hitting us just right. While she fussed with the tent stakes, I gathered kindling for later and explored the edges of our little clearing. There were these weird marks on some of the pine trees, deep gouges in the bark about shoulder height, almost like someone had been carving into them with a knife but stopped halfway through. I figured it was probably from hunters marking territory, or maybe bears scratching, though I didn't mention the bear possibility to Kayla, since she was already paranoid about wildlife. By late afternoon, we had everything set up, tent secured, sleeping bags rolled out. Our food hung up in a bear bag between 2 trees about 50 feet from camp. The forest had gotten quieter as the day wore on, that busy chatter of birds fading to just occasional calls in the distance. We made sandwiches and sat on the fallen log, watching the sunlight filter through the pine needles in these golden streams that made everything look like a painting. Kayla was going on about how her boss had tried to call her that morning about some campaign deadline, and we were both laughing about how there was no way anyone could reach us out here, our phones showing no service since we'd left the main road. Around 5 o'clock, just as we were debating whether to start the fire or go explore a bit more before dark, we heard footsteps on the trail. Not the light, quick steps of a deer or the shuffling of a raccoon. These were deliberate, heavy boot steps crunching through the leaves. A man emerged from the tree line, and right away, everything about him seemed wrong for the setting. He was wearing clean khaki pants and a button-up shirt, like he'd dressed for a business casual Friday, not a hiking trail. His hair was slicked back with so much gel it looked wet, and he had this perfectly trimmed goatee that belonged in a suburban office park, not the middle of the Cherokee National Forest. But what really made my chest tighten was the rifle slung over his shoulder. Not unusual for Tennessee. Hunters were everywhere, but it was the way he carried it. Too casual, like it was a fashion accessory rather than a tool. He stopped at the edge of our clearing, maybe 20 feet from where we were sitting, and just stared at us. Not a friendly, "Oh hey fellow campers" look, but this cold assessment, like he was cataloging everything about our campsite. Kayla grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks, and we both stayed frozen on that log, waiting for him to say something, to explain why he was just standing there watching us. "You girls don't belong here," he finally said, and his voice had this weird flatness to it, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. He took 3 steps into our clearing, his dress shoes, actual leather dress shoes, crunching on the pine needles and leaves. The rifle shifted on his shoulder, and I could see it better now. Some kind of hunting rifle with a scope that looked expensive, the metal gleaming like it had been polished that morning. His eyes were this pale gray color, almost silver in the fading sunlight, and they never blinked as he looked between me and Kayla. "This is private property, family land, goes back generations." The way he said it, emphasizing each word like we were children who needed things explained slowly, made my skin prickle with anger and fear at the same time. Kayla found her voice first, always the brave one, and said we'd checked all the maps, that this was national forest land, public camping allowed with proper permits. He smiled then, but it was all teeth and no warmth, the kind of smile you'd see on someone enjoying a cruel joke. "Maps can be wrong," he said, taking another step closer. "Government makes mistakes all the time, but we know what's ours." I stood up slowly, pulling Kayla with me, trying to keep my voice steady as I told him we'd leave immediately if there was a misunderstanding. My legs felt like water, but I forced myself to move toward our tent, thinking if we could just pack up quickly and get out of there, everything would be fine. But he moved too, positioning himself between us and the trail we'd come in on, still with that horrible empty smile stretched across his face. "Where you from?" he asked, like we were having a normal conversation, like he wasn't blocking our only exit. "Nashville," Kayla answered, her voice higher than usual. "City girls," he said, almost whispering it, like it was a curse word. "Coming out here, thinking you own the place, setting up camp wherever you please." His free hand, the one not holding the rifle strap, kept opening and closing into a fist, and I noticed his fingernails were weirdly long for a man, filed into points that looked sharp enough to scratch. The sun was dropping behind the trees now, casting these long shadows across the clearing, and I realized with growing panic that even if we ran, we'd be hiking in the dark soon, 3 miles through unfamiliar forest with this man potentially following us. "We'll pack up right now," I said again, louder this time, already moving toward the tent. "No need for trouble. We didn't know." But he just stood there, watching us with those unblinking silver eyes, his pointed fingernails now tapping against the rifle stock in this steady rhythm that sounded like a countdown. We started packing frantically, shoving sleeping bags into stuff sacks without rolling them properly, yanking tent stakes out of the ground so hard one bent completely in half. The man had moved again, now standing near the fire ring, running his fingers along the stones like he was inspecting our work. "You know what we do to trespassers out here?" he asked, his voice carrying across the clearing even though he was practically whispering. "Same thing we've always done. Same thing my daddy did and his daddy before him." Kayla dropped the tent pole she was holding, the metal clanging against a rock, and the sound seemed to echo forever in the growing darkness. I could hear her breathing getting faster, these little gasps that meant she was close to a panic attack, something I'd only seen happen once before when we got lost driving through Kentucky. The man unslung his rifle, not pointing it at us yet, just cradling it in his arms like a baby, running those sharp fingernails along the wooden stock. "There's stories about these woods," he continued, taking slow, measured steps around the edge of our clearing, like an animal circling prey. Stories about girls who didn't listen, who thought they knew better. Every instinct in my body was screaming to run, but our packs were still half full, our bear bag still hanging in the tree, and I knew we'd need at least some supplies if we had any chance of making it back to the car in the dark. Then we heard it, another set of footsteps coming from the opposite side of the clearing, from deeper in the forest where no trail existed. A second man emerged, younger, maybe early 20s, with the same silver eyes but wild, uncombed hair that hung to his shoulders in greasy strands. He was wearing overalls with no shirt underneath, his chest covered in these intricate scars that looked deliberate, like someone had carved patterns into his skin. "Found them just like you said, Uncle Roy," the younger one called out, and his voice had this sing-song quality that made everything he said sound like a taunt. He was carrying something in his right hand. At first I thought it was a stick, but as he got closer I could see it was a machete, the blade rusty except for the edge, which gleamed sharp and clean. 2 of them, just like those ones from last spring. My whole body went rigid at that comment. Kayla made this small whimpering sound and grabbed my hand, squeezing so hard I thought my bones might break. Uncle Roy, apparently that was the first man's name, smiled wider, showing teeth that were too white, too perfect, like dentures that didn't quite fit his mouth. "City girls never learn," he said, shifting his rifle so it was pointed vaguely in our direction. Not quite aimed, but close enough to make the threat clear. "They come out here with their fancy gear and their maps, thinking the whole world belongs to them." The younger one laughed, this high-pitched giggle that didn't match his scarred chest and wild appearance, spinning the machete in his hand like a baton. "Please," I heard myself say, surprised that my voice came out at all. "We're leaving, right now. We won't tell anyone about this place, we promise." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew how pathetic they sounded. The nephew, I couldn't think of him any other way, had moved to block the other side of the clearing, the side that led deeper into the forest. We were trapped between them, 2 girls with half-packed camping gear against 2 armed locals who knew every tree, every rock, every hiding spot for miles. Uncle Roy took the rifle off his shoulder completely now, checking the chamber with practiced ease. "You know what the problem is with promises from city folk?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. "They don't mean nothing, just words, like when the government promised to leave our land alone." He spat on the ground, this thick wad of tobacco juice that landed near our tent. The darkness was coming fast now, that sudden mountain darkness where one minute you can see everything and the next you can barely make out shapes. Our flashlights were in our packs, but reaching for them felt like it might trigger something, might make these men stop talking and start doing whatever they'd been planning since they found us. Kayla's panic attack was getting worse. I could feel her whole body shaking against mine, could hear those gasping breaths getting shorter and shorter. Without warning, Uncle Roy raised the rifle and fired into the air, the sound exploding through the clearing like thunder. Both Kayla and I screamed, dropping to the ground instinctively, our ears ringing from the blast. When I looked up, both men were laughing, the nephew actually doubling over and slapping his knee like it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. "Run!" Uncle Roy said, lowering the rifle until it was pointed directly at us. "You got 30 seconds head start. Better make them count." For a heartbeat, neither of us moved, our brains refusing to process what was happening. Then the nephew started counting, loud and slow. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Kayla yanked me to my feet and we ran, leaving everything behind, our tent, our packs, our phones, everything except the clothes on our backs. We crashed through the underbrush in the opposite direction from both men, branches tearing at our faces and arms, roots trying to trip us with every step. Behind us, I could hear the nephew's voice getting fainter. 15 Mississippi. 16 Mississippi. My mind was racing, trying to remember anything about the area from the maps we'd studied. There was a creek somewhere to the east, and if we could find it, we could follow it downstream to eventually hit a road. But in the darkness, with no compass, no light, east might as well have been Mars. We kept running, our breathing so loud I was sure they could track us by sound alone, waiting for the counting to stop, waiting for the hunt to begin. The counting stopped at 30, and then we heard the worst sound possible, whooping and hollering like this was some kind of celebration. Another gunshot cracked through the air, not aimed at us but fired into the sky, followed by that high-pitched laugh from the nephew. We kept running blind through the darkness, holding hands so we wouldn't lose each other, when suddenly Kayla's foot caught on something and we both went down hard. My knee hit a rock and I felt the skin tear open, warm blood immediately soaking through my jeans. But the pain was nothing compared to the terror when we heard branches breaking somewhere behind us, not far, maybe 100 yards. They were tracking us, and they were getting closer. Kayla pulled me behind a massive fallen tree, and we pressed ourselves against the rotting bark, trying to control our breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I was convinced they'd hear it. For maybe 5 minutes we stayed frozen there, listening to them crashing through the forest, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. Then I remembered something. My car keys were in my pocket, and attached to them was a tiny LED keychain light my mom had given me. With shaking fingers, I pulled it out and clicked it on, the weak beam barely penetrating 3 feet into the darkness. But it was enough to see that we were near a steep slope heading downward, and at the bottom I could hear it, water running over rocks. We half slid, half fell down that slope, using trees to slow our descent, both of us getting covered in mud and dead leaves. The creek was maybe 10 feet wide, shallow but moving fast, cold enough to take your breath away when we splashed into it. But we didn't stop, following it downstream, slipping on the algae-covered rocks, falling into the water over and over until we were soaked and shivering. Behind us, I heard Uncle Roy's voice, closer than expected. "They're in the water. Smart little things." Another gunshot, and this time I heard the bullet hit a tree somewhere to our left. We ran faster, the creek gradually widening, the sound of the water hopefully masking our splashing. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we saw lights through the trees, a house, then another, then the blessed sight of a paved road. We scrambled up the bank, our clothes weighing us down, and ran toward the nearest house where a porch light was on. The elderly woman who answered our frantic knocking took one look at us, soaked, bloody, crying, and immediately called 911 while pulling us inside. The police found our campsite destroyed, everything torn apart or stolen, but no trace of the 2 men. They said there were no families owning private land in that area, that it had been federal forest for 50 years. But they also said there had been other reports, other campers who'd been run off by locals claiming ownership, though none who'd been shot at before. Kayla and I drove back to Nashville in silence the next day, after giving our statements and declining to press charges we weren't even sure could stick. We never went camping again, and we never talked about that night after the first week. But sometimes I Google that area, looking for news stories about missing hikers, hoping I never find what I'm afraid is out there. Last August, I went camping with my college friends at Pine Ridge State Park in Colorado. We were all nursing graduates who'd just finished our boards, and this trip was our celebration before everyone scattered to different hospitals across the country. There were 5 of us, me, Jessica, Amber, Nicole, and Megan, and we'd picked a campsite pretty deep into the park, about 40 minutes from the main road. The spot was perfect, surrounded by tall pines and next to a small creek that made this peaceful bubbling sound. We'd spent the whole day hiking, roasting marshmallows, and catching up on life. By the time we crawled into our tents around 11, I was exhausted in that good way you get after a day outdoors. Jessica and I were sharing one tent, Amber and Nicole had another, and Megan had brought her own small one because she snored and didn't want to keep anyone awake. I remember waking up to this soft, polite knocking on our tent. Not banging or scratching, just 3 gentle taps, like someone knocking on an office door. My phone showed 2:07 a.m. when I checked it, the brightness making me squint. At first I thought maybe Megan needed something. Maybe she'd forgotten her water bottle or had to use the bathroom and was scared to go alone. But then I heard this voice, and it definitely wasn't Megan's. "Excuse me? Hello, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I really need some help." The voice was high and sweet, with this slight southern drawl that reminded me of my aunt from Georgia. Jessica was still dead asleep beside me, snoring softly with her arm thrown over her face. I lay there for a second, trying to process what was happening. The woman knocked again, still gentle, still polite. "Please, I know it's late, but my phone died, and I'm lost. I just need to make a quick call." I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent flap, just enough to peek out. What I saw made every muscle in my body tense up. There was a woman standing about 3 feet from our tent, and she looked completely out of place. She was wearing a floral sundress, the kind with tiny yellow daisies on white fabric, and these strappy sandals with little heels. Her hair was done up in this elaborate bun with what looked like pearl pins holding it in place. She had on full makeup too, red lipstick and everything, like she'd just come from a wedding reception or a fancy dinner. But here's what really got me. She had absolutely nothing with her. No backpack, no purse, no phone, no flashlight, no jacket. Nothing. The nearest parking area was at least a 30-minute hike through rough terrain, and she was standing there in heels and a sundress like she'd just stepped out of a garden party. The woman smiled when she saw me, and it was this perfectly normal, friendly smile that you'd expect from someone asking for directions at a grocery store. "Oh, thank goodness you're awake. I'm so embarrassed, but I got separated from my group, and I've been walking for hours trying to find my way back to the parking lot." Her voice never wavered, stayed perfectly pleasant and calm. I asked her what group she was with, and she tilted her head slightly, like she was thinking. "We were having a little get-together, a celebration actually, but I went for a walk to see the stars, and I guess I wandered too far." She laughed, this tinkling little sound that seemed rehearsed. "The thing is, there were no other campsites near us. We'd specifically chosen this spot because it was isolated, and there definitely weren't any celebrations or parties happening in the middle of the forest on a random Friday night." I told her I could let her use my phone, and I started reaching back into the tent to grab it from my sleeping bag. That's when she took a step closer and said, "Actually, would you mind walking me back to the main trail? I'm terrible with directions and I'd probably just get lost again." She clasped her hands in front of her, like she was praying, and gave me this hopeful look. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was wrong with this whole situation. Who gets lost in heels? Who goes for a nighttime walk in the forest wearing a sundress? And how did she even find our specific campsite in the dark? I told her I'd wake up my friends and we could all help her together. The moment I said that, her expression changed for just a split second. This flash of frustration crossed her face before the smile snapped back into place. "Oh no, please don't wake them. I'd feel so guilty disturbing everyone." "You seem so kind, couldn't you just point me in the right direction?" Before I could answer, I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. From somewhere behind the woman, deeper in the forest, came this low whistle. Not a bird, it was definitely human. The woman didn't react to it at all, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge it, just kept staring at me with that same pleasant smile. Then another whistle answered from the opposite direction, maybe 50 feet to our left. And another one behind our tents. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The woman was still talking, something about how she just needed a few minutes of my time, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was counting the whistles. There were at least 4 different directions they were coming from, and they were getting closer. The woman must have noticed my expression because she reached out her hand toward me. "Please, honey, I really need your help. Just come with me for a minute." Her fingers were inches from the tent flap, and that's when I noticed her nails. They were caked with dirt underneath, like she'd been digging in the ground. I yanked the zipper shut so fast I almost broke it. The woman's voice immediately changed, dropping the sweet southern accent entirely. "Open the tent." It was flat, emotionless, like she was reading from a script. I shook Jessica awake, clamping my hand over her mouth before she could say anything. Her eyes went wide when she saw my face, and I whispered that we needed to wake the others now. The woman outside had gone quiet, but I could hear footsteps circling our tent, slow and deliberate. Then more footsteps from different directions, converging on our campsite. Jessica grabbed the emergency whistle from her backpack, while I fumbled with my phone to call 911. But there was no signal. We were too deep in the park. The footsteps stopped. Everything went completely silent for maybe 10 seconds. Then all hell broke loose. Someone started shaking Megan's tent violently, and I heard her scream. At the same time, something heavy slammed into the side of our tent, nearly knocking it over. Jessica started blowing the emergency whistle as loud as she could, while I screamed for everyone to stay in their tents and call for help. The beam of my flashlight swung wildly as I tried to see what was happening, and I caught glimpses through the tent fabric. There were at least 5 people out there, all dressed in regular street clothes, all wrong for camping. A man in khakis and a polo shirt was pulling at Amber and Nicole's tent stakes. Another woman in a cocktail dress was cutting through Megan's rainfly with something sharp. They weren't saying anything, just working systematically like they'd done this before. Jessica kept blowing that whistle, and I started hitting the emergency button on my phone even though there was no signal, hoping maybe it would store the GPS location or something. Then Amber did something that probably saved us. She had this air horn in her tent that she'd brought as a joke to wake us up in the morning, and she started blasting it over and over. The sound was deafening, echoing through the forest like a siren. The attackers actually stopped for a second, and I saw them looking at each other. The woman in the sundress made this sharp gesture with her hand, and they all started moving faster, more aggressively. But Amber kept hitting that air horn, and within maybe 30 seconds we heard dogs barking in the distance. There was another camping group about a half-mile away that had 2 German shepherds, and those dogs were going crazy. Then we saw flashlight beams bouncing through the trees, getting closer, and male voices shouting, asking if everything was okay. The woman in the sundress whistled once, sharp and loud, and just like that, they all stopped and melted back into the forest. The other campers reached us about 2 minutes later, 3 guys and an older couple with their dogs. They found us huddled together between our ruined tents, Jessica still clutching the whistle, Amber holding the air horn like a weapon. Megan's tent was completely destroyed, slashed to ribbons. All our stakes had been pulled up, our stuff scattered everywhere. The men helped us gather what we could while the woman called the rangers on their satellite phone. We didn't wait for them to arrive. We hiked out in the dark with our rescuers, leaving most of our gear behind. The dogs kept growling and looking back into the forest the whole way, hackles raised, like they knew those people were still out there watching us. At the ranger station, we filed reports and gave descriptions, but the rangers seemed weirdly unsurprised. One of them, this older guy with gray hair, pulled me aside and told me we were lucky. He said there had been similar incidents over the past 5 years. Groups of people in strange clothes approaching campers at night, always with some polite request for help, always trying to separate one person from their group. He showed me a map with red pins marking the incidents, and there were at least 12 of them, all in remote camping areas within a 100-mile radius. The most recent one before ours had happened just 3 weeks earlier. A solo hiker who'd thankfully locked himself in his car when a well-dressed elderly man knocked on his tent at 3 a.m., asking for jumper cables. The ranger said they suspected it was some kind of organized group, maybe human traffickers or something worse, but they could never find any trace of them afterward. No footprints, no campsite, no vehicles, nothing. Just traumatized campers and destroyed gear. He gave me his direct number and said to call if I remembered any other details. 2 months later, I got a call from him. They'd arrested 8 people after they tried the same thing on an off-duty cop who was camping with his family. Turns out it was this group that had been kidnapping campers for years, taking them across state lines. They'd pick isolated spots, send in someone non-threatening looking first to gauge the situation, then attack if they couldn't lure someone away peacefully. The woman in the sundress was apparently the ringleader's wife. We were lucky that night, luckier than I probably realize even now. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd stepped out of that tent to help her, if Jessica hadn't woken up, if Amber hadn't brought that air horn. The ranger told me they found evidence that the group had been watching us all day, waiting for night to fall. They'd probably seen 5 young women and thought we'd be easy targets. What still haunts me is how normal that woman seemed at first, how her request for help was so reasonable sounding. I've gone camping since then, but never without a satellite phone, never in isolated spots, and I always trust my gut when something doesn't add up. If someone knocks on your tent in the middle of the night, no matter how polite they sound, no matter how much they say they need help, don't open it. Real hikers in trouble don't approach sleeping campers at 2 a.m. dressed for a dinner party. They just don't. The old Riverside Playhouse had been abandoned for 12 years when we decided to drive out there that Saturday night. People in town had started calling it the Purple Castle after some kids swore they saw the cross on top glowing violet at midnight, which sounded like complete bullshit, until half the senior class started talking about it. The building sat on Route 47, about 6 miles past the last gas station, this massive brick structure that used to be a Methodist church before someone turned it into a community theater. My dad's construction company had actually bid on the renovation project years ago, so I knew the layout pretty well from the old blueprints he kept in his office. The place had these narrow Gothic windows that were mostly broken now, and the white paint had peeled off in sheets that looked like dead skin. During the day, it was just another eyesore the county kept promising to tear down, but at night, with the fog rolling in from the creek behind it, the whole structure seemed to lean forward like it was listening for something. Travis had been obsessing over the story for weeks, showing up at my house with screenshots from local Facebook groups and blurry photos people had posted. His cousin Bethany was visiting from Michigan for Thanksgiving break, and she thought we were all idiots for believing any of it, but she came along anyway because sitting around watching her aunt's cable TV was worse than chasing small-town legends. We took my dad's F-150, this beast of a truck with a bent tailgate and a dashboard that rattled like dice in a cup whenever you hit 40 miles per hour. The heater only worked if you punched the vents just right, and Bethany spent the first 10 minutes of the drive trying to get warm air flowing, while Travis went through his evidence folder on his phone. The route out there took us through the back roads past the Foster farm, where their 3-legged dog always tried to race vehicles along the fence line, past the water tower some genius had painted to look like a giant golf ball, through stretches of woods so thick the headlights seemed to get swallowed up after 20 feet. We pulled into the gravel lot around 11:45, and the first thing I noticed was how wrong the silence felt. Not peaceful quiet like you'd expect from an empty building, but this heavy absence of sound that made your ears ring. The playhouse loomed above us, 4 stories of brick and broken dreams, with that metal cross on top catching the moonlight in a way that made it look silver. Definitely not purple. Travis immediately started filming with his phone while Bethany and I grabbed the flashlights from behind the driver's seat. The main entrance had been boarded up years ago, but kids had pried open a side door near the loading dock, where they used to bring in set pieces. Inside, the air tasted like mold and bird shit, and our footsteps echoed in that specific way that tells you a place has been empty for too long. The lobby still had the old ticket booth with its brass bars, and someone had spray-painted "Abandon Hope" across the concession stand, because apparently even vandals in our town were pretentious English majors. The main theater was through a set of double doors that groaned like they were in physical pain when we pushed them open. Rows of red velvet seats stretched toward a stage where the curtain had partially collapsed, hanging there like a massive tongue. Travis kept whispering about electromagnetic fields and temperature drops while waving his phone around, but all I could focus on was this weird smell, like copper pennies mixed with something chemical. Bethany found the stairs to the balcony behind what used to be the coat check, and we followed her up, our flashlight beams dancing across water-stained walls covered in graffiti dating back decades. From up there, you could see the whole theater, including the orchestra pit filled with broken chairs and what looked like old bird nests made from programs and sheet music. The ceiling had partially caved in near the back, creating this jagged hole where you could see straight through to the bell tower, where the cross was mounted. At exactly midnight, Travis's phone started going haywire. The screen flickering between apps he wasn't even touching, the flashlight function turning on and off in this rapid strobe that hurt to look at. Then we heard it. This deep grinding sound from above us, like concrete scraping against metal, slow and deliberate. Bethany grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, and we all looked up at that hole in the ceiling just as something moved across it, blocking out the stars for a second. Not floating or flying, but climbing maybe, using the exposed beams like a jungle gym. The cross hadn't turned purple, but there was this faint violet glow coming from somewhere behind it, pulsing like a heartbeat. Travis tried to zoom in with his phone camera, but the thing kept refusing to focus, showing nothing but blur and static. The grinding sound got louder, and pieces of plaster started raining down from the edges of the hole, hitting the seats below with sharp little pops that sounded like bones breaking. That's when we saw the first claw mark appear on one of the exposed wooden beams, fresh splinters curling away from 4 parallel gouges that had to be 8 inches long. Whatever was up there was heavy enough to make the whole building groan, and it was moving toward the ladder that led down from the bell tower, the same ladder we'd need to pass to get back to the stairs. My dad had taught me to recognize stress sounds in old buildings, and what I was hearing now meant something way too big was putting weight on structures that were already compromised. Bethany was already backing toward the balcony stairs, her flashlight beam shaking so bad it looked like a disco ball, while Travis kept muttering "holy shit" over and over, still trying to film even though his hands were trembling. Another scraping sound echoed through the theater, closer this time, and a shower of wood dust drifted down through our flashlight beams like snow. The smell got stronger too, that copper penny stench mixed with something else, something organic and wrong, like roadkill that had been baking in the sun. We ran down those balcony stairs so fast I'm surprised nobody broke their neck, our footsteps thundering through the empty building while that grinding, scraping noise followed from above. In the lobby, Travis tripped over a pile of old programs and went down hard, his phone skittering across the floor, still recording, the lights spinning crazily across the walls. As Bethany and I hauled him up, we heard the unmistakable sound of wood splintering above us, followed by a crash that shook dust from every surface. Through the doorway to the theater, we could see something dropping from the ceiling in chunks. Not just plaster and wood, but something dark and wet that hit the seats with heavy, meaty thuds. The side door we'd entered through was only 20 feet away, but those were the longest 20 feet of my life, especially when we heard whatever was up there start moving faster. The building's old bones creaking and popping under its weight like knuckles cracking. We burst out of the building into the cold November air, and the difference in temperature made my lungs burn. The truck was right where we'd left it, thank God, and I had the keys out before we even reached it, my fingers fumbling with the keychain my dad had made from a piece of copper pipe. That's when Travis screamed and pointed at the roof of the playhouse, where something huge was perched on the bell tower, silhouetted against the moon. It was the size of a small car but moved like a massive cat, muscles rippling under what looked like patchy fur, or maybe feathers. I couldn't tell in the darkness. The purple glow was coming from behind it, from inside the bell tower itself, casting this sick violet outline around its body. The thing's head turned toward us, and even from 50 yards away, I could see eyes that reflected our flashlights like a deer's, except there were too many of them, arranged wrong, scattered across what should have been its face. It made this sound, not quite a roar, more like a deep whistle mixed with grinding metal, and started climbing down the side of the building, its claws leaving deep gouges in the brick. The truck started on the second try, which was a miracle considering how temperamental that engine could be in cold weather. I threw it in reverse so hard the transmission screamed, spinning gravel everywhere as we tore out of the parking lot. Behind us, I could hear that thing hit the ground with a thud that I swear we felt through the truck's chassis, and then came the sound of it running, heavy rhythmic impacts that were gaining on us way too fast for something that size. Bethany was turned around in her seat, watching through the back window, her voice climbing higher with each word as she described it, loping after us on all fours, covering maybe 15 feet with each bound. The truck's speedometer hit 60 on that narrow access road, way too fast for the conditions. But I didn't care because in the side mirror I could see those eyes getting closer, all 6 or 7 of them glowing in the reflection of our taillights. Then it jumped, and I mean really jumped, launching itself through the air in this impossible arc that brought it down right in the truck bed with an impact that lifted the front wheels off the ground for a second. The whole truck lurched sideways as 3,000 pounds of muscle and fury landed in the bed, and I fought to keep us on the road while metal screamed and bent behind us. Through the rear window we could see massive claws puncturing through the bed liner, each one as thick as my thumb and curved like meat hooks, scrabbling for purchase on the metal. The thing's weight made the truck fishtail wildly, and I could barely control it as we hit the main road doing 70. Travis was screaming something about calling 911, but what would we even say? That we were being chased by something that looked like a mountain lion crossed with a nightmare. The creature's face pressed against the back window for one horrible second, and up close I could see it had skin like a bat's wing stretched over too many bones. And those eyes weren't even in eye sockets, just stuck into the flesh wherever. It raised one massive paw and brought it down on the roof of the cab, and the metal buckled inward with a sound like a giant stepping on a soda can, safety glass from the rear window exploding into 1,000 little cubes that pelted us like hail. Just when I thought the roof was going to collapse completely, we hit the bridge over Miller's Creek doing almost 80, and the sudden change from asphalt to concrete joints made the whole truck bounce violently. The creature lost its grip for just a second, sliding backward in the truck bed with a furious shriek that sounded like tearing sheet metal. That's when I remembered the railroad crossing about a quarter-mile ahead, the one where you had to slow down to almost nothing unless you wanted to destroy your suspension. But slowing down meant giving that thing another chance to get at us through the now open rear window. I made the choice to hit it at full speed, yelling at Travis and Bethany to brace themselves. The impact when we hit those tracks was brutal, launching the entire truck airborne for what felt like forever, but was probably only a second or two. I heard the creature hit something hard as it got thrown from the bed, followed by the sound of it crashing through the woods beside the road, branches snapping like firecrackers. I didn't stop driving until we reached the 24-hour gas station at the edge of town, pulling up right under the brightest lights near the door. My dad's truck looked like it had been attacked by a gang with sledgehammers and pickaxes. The roof caved in, the bed torn to shreds with those massive claw marks gouged deep into the metal, some of them going clean through. The tailgate was hanging by one hinge, and there was this thick, dark substance splattered across the bed that smelled like a mixture of tar and spoiled meat. Travis threw up in the parking lot while Bethany called her mom with some story about hitting a deer. We never reported it to the cops, never went back to check on anything, just told my dad that vandals had trashed his truck while we were at a movie. He didn't believe us, obviously, but what was the alternative explanation? The local news ran a story 3 days later about a bear being spotted near the old playhouse, showed some blurry trail cam footage of something large moving through the trees. They brought in wildlife experts who said black bears sometimes grow much larger than usual when they have access to consistent food sources, maybe from the dumpsters behind the abandoned building. But I know what bears look like, and that thing had too many joints in its legs, too many eyes, and no bear leaves claw marks that go through quarter-inch steel. The Purple Castle is still standing out there on Route 47, and sometimes I drive past it during the day, but I always speed up when I do, and I never ever look at it after dark. Spring break of my junior year, me and 5 friends from college decided to go camping at this lake about 3 hours north of campus. We were all stressed out from midterms and figured a weekend in nature would help us decompress before the final push to summer. The place we picked was called Silver Pine Lake, one of those spots that locals knew about but wasn't overrun with tourists yet. My roommate Brandon had been there with his family a few years earlier, and swore it was the perfect spot. Secluded enough to feel like real camping, but still close enough to civilization if we needed anything. We loaded up 2 cars with our gear on a Friday afternoon, cranked up the music, and hit the road feeling like we owned the world. The weather was perfect, mid-70s with 0 chance of rain according to every app we checked. We even joked about how we were probably overpacking with all the tarps and rain covers we brought. The group was me, Brandon, this guy Nathan from our statistics class, Brandon's girlfriend Ashley, her roommate Claire, and Claire's cousin Jenna, who was visiting from out of state. We'd all hung out before at parties and study groups, but this was our first time doing something like this together. The drive up was perfect. Windows down, everyone taking turns with the music, stopping at this sketchy gas station that sold the best beef jerky I've ever had in my life. When we finally got to the lake around sunset, the water was like glass, reflecting all these insane orange and pink colors from the sky. We found a clearing about 50 yards from the shore, surrounded by pine trees on 3 sides, with a perfect view of the water. The spot already had a fire pit from previous campers, which we took as a good sign. We spent the next hour setting up our 3 tents, Brandon and Ashley in one, Nathan and I in another, and Claire and Jenna in the third. That first night was exactly what we'd hoped for. We got a fire going, cooked hot dogs and burgers, and sat around drinking beers and telling stories. Nathan brought his guitar and played some songs while we made s'mores. Around 11, we noticed another group had set up camp across the lake. We could see their fire flickering through the trees, maybe half a mile away. Ashley mentioned hearing voices carrying over the water earlier, but we couldn't make out what they were saying. The sounds out there were incredible. Owls hooting, fish jumping in the lake, branches creaking in the breeze. Claire kept making everyone shut up every few minutes so she could identify different bird calls with this app on her phone. By midnight, we were all pretty tired and decided to call it a night. I remember Nathan and I talking for maybe another 20 minutes in our tent about this girl he liked before we both passed out. I woke up around 7:30 because the sun was hitting our tent and it was getting warm inside. Nathan was still snoring next to me, so I tried to be quiet as I unzipped the tent flap to go take a leak. The morning was gorgeous. Mist coming off the lake, birds going crazy in the trees, that perfect camping morning smell of dew and pine needles. But when I stepped out and turned to zip the tent back up, I saw it. There was this cut running down the side of our tent, maybe 3 feet long, perfectly straight like someone had used a razor or a really sharp knife. The fabric was separated clean, and I could see Nathan's sleeping bag through the gap. At first, I thought maybe we'd snagged it on something while setting up, but the cut was too precise, too deliberate. Then I noticed the edges of the fabric were frayed outward, which meant it had been cut from the outside. My first instinct was to check if our stuff had been stolen. I ducked back into the tent and went through our backpacks. Wallets, phones, Brandon's expensive camera, Nathan's iPad, everything was still there. That made it even weirder. I woke Nathan up and showed him the cut, and he had the same reaction I did, checking all our gear while muttering, "What the hell," over and over. We went to check on Brandon and Ashley's tent, and that's when my chest got tight. Their tent had an identical cut, same length, same clean precision, running parallel to the ground about 2 feet up from the base. Brandon came crawling out when he heard us talking, took one look at the damage, and immediately went into protective mode, checking on Ashley and looking around the campsite like whoever did this might still be watching. The girl's tent was the worst. 2 cuts, forming an X pattern on the side facing the woods. Nobody wanted to say it out loud at first, but we all knew this was intentional. Someone had walked through our camp while we were sleeping and cut our tents with something sharp. But why? Nothing was missing, nobody was hurt, and there were no footprints or disturbed ground that we could see. Jenna pointed out that whoever did this had to be incredibly quiet. We were only 10 feet apart from each other, and nobody heard anything. The cuts were so clean that the person must have used a fresh blade, probably a box cutter or hunting knife. Ashley was trying to stay calm, but I could see her scrolling through her phone, probably checking if there was enough signal to call someone. Claire walked around the perimeter of our camp, using her phone to take pictures of everything, saying we should document this in case we needed to file a police report later. Brandon found a long stick and started poking through the bushes around our site, like he was expecting to find someone hiding there. We had a group meeting by the dead fire pit, everyone still in their sleep clothes, trying to figure out what to do. Nathan suggested it might have been animals, maybe a bear investigating our camp, but we all knew that was bullshit. Bears don't make surgical cuts in perfect lines. Brandon wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but Ashley pointed out it was only 8 in the morning, and we'd driven 3 hours to get here. Plus, we'd already paid for 2 nights at the campsite. Claire had a different theory. Maybe it was some kind of local hazing thing, teenagers from a nearby town messing with out-of-state campers. She'd found a forum post from 2 years ago mentioning vandalism at Silver Pine Lake, though nothing specifically about tent cutting. We spent the next hour going through everything, checking the car tires, making sure nothing else was damaged. I walked down to the lake shore, partly to clear my head, and partly to see if there were any other campers around who might have seen or heard something. The campsite across the lake was already empty. Their fire pit was cold when Nathan and I hiked over there around 9:30, but there were fresh tire tracks leading out to the access road. We found some cigarette butts, a few empty beer cans, and weirdly, a brand new roll of duct tape still in its packaging, just sitting on one of the logs they'd used as seats. Nathan picked it up, and we both had the same thought. Why would someone leave this behind? On our walk back, we ran into an older couple camping about a quarter mile down the shore. They had this massive RV and were cooking breakfast outside. The woman, Dorothy, said they'd been coming to Silver Pine for 15 years and had never heard of anything like what happened to us. Her husband mentioned seeing headlights moving through the woods around 2 in the morning, but he figured it was just someone arriving late. He said the lights stopped for about 10 minutes near where our camp would be, then continued toward the other side of the lake. When we got back and told everyone about the headlights, the mood shifted completely. Ashley started packing her stuff, saying she wasn't spending another night there, and I didn't blame her. But then Claire made a point that stuck with me. Whoever did this wanted to scare us, and if we left, they won. She suggested we stay but take precautions. We could move our tents closer together, take shifts staying awake, and keep the fire going all night. Nathan said his dad had taught him how to set up a perimeter alarm with fishing line and empty cans, which sounded paranoid at the time, but everyone agreed to it. We spent the rest of the morning fixing our tents with the duct tape we'd found, which seemed like cosmic irony, using what might have been the vandals' own supplies to repair their damage. Brandon drove into town, about 20 minutes away, to buy more supplies, batteries for flashlights, an air horn, some rope, and enough energy drinks to keep whoever was on watch awake. The day passed slowly, with this weird tension hanging over everything. We still swam in the lake, made lunch, played cards, but everyone kept scanning the tree line, looking for movement. Around 4 in the afternoon, 2 guys in a small fishing boat came close to our shore. They looked like they were in their 30s, wearing matching camo jackets even though it was 70 degrees out. They didn't fish, just drifted there for about 15 minutes, staring at our camp. When Brandon waved at them, they didn't wave back, just started their motor and headed toward the far end of the lake. Jenna took photos of them with her phone, zooming in as much as she could. Later, when we looked at the pictures, we noticed one of them had what looked like a knife sheath on his belt, the kind hunters use for skinning deer. The other guy had been holding something in his lap the whole time. We couldn't tell what it was from the photos, but it was wrapped in a dark cloth. By nightfall, we had our defenses set up. The tents were arranged in a tight triangle with the fire pit in the center, and Nathan's alarm system created a circle about 20 feet out. We agreed on 3-hour shifts, 2 people awake at all times, 1 tending the fire and 1 walking the perimeter with a flashlight. Brandon and Ashley took first watch. Nathan and I had middle shift from 1 to 4, and Claire and Jenna would handle the early morning. We tried to act normal, making dinner and talking around the fire, but everyone was on edge. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every shadow looked like a person. Around 11, just as Claire and Jenna were getting ready to sleep, We heard an engine in the distance. Headlights swept through the trees on the access road, moving slowly like before. The vehicle stopped at the same spot the couple had described, and the engine cut off. We all stood there frozen, waiting to see if someone would approach. After about 5 minutes, the engine started again, and the vehicle continued on, but none of us relaxed. The first shift passed without incident, according to Brandon, though he said they kept hearing splashing sounds from the lake that didn't sound like fish. Nathan and I took over at 1 in the morning, armed with flashlights and the air horn. Around 2:30, I was adding wood to the fire when Nathan grabbed my arm. He pointed his flashlight toward the trees, and I saw them, 2 figures standing just outside our alarm perimeter, maybe 30 feet away. They weren't moving, just standing there watching us. I grabbed the air horn and held it up, shouting that we could see them and they needed to leave. They didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then they turned and walked back into the woods. No rushing, no running, just calmly walking away like they had all the time in the world. We woke everyone up immediately, and nobody went back to sleep. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, taking turns watching different directions, until the sun finally came up, and we could see the lake clearly again. We packed up everything in record time that morning, nobody even suggesting we should stay for the second night we'd paid for. While we were taking down the tents, Claire found something that made us all stop. There were fresh cuts in the fabric again, smaller this time, just 2 or 3 inches long, on the back sides of each tent where we couldn't see from the fire. These cuts were different though, arranged in patterns. 3 parallel lines on mine and Nathan's tent, a small triangle on Brandon and Ashley's, and what looked like the letter V on the girls' tent. They must have done it while we were all watching the 2 figures at the front of our camp. There had been more of them circling us, marking our tents while we were distracted. The realization that we'd been surrounded, that they'd gotten that close even with all our precautions, made everyone move even faster. We threw everything into the cars without even folding it properly, just wanting to get out of there. On the drive home, nobody talked much at first. Then Ashley pulled up local news on her phone and found something that made us pull over. 3 weeks before our trip, a family had abandoned their campsite at Silver Pine Lake in the middle of the night, after finding their tents slashed. A week before that, a couple reported similar vandalism to the Park Service. The article mentioned that rangers were investigating but had no leads. We never reported what happened to us. We just wanted to forget about it and move on. But sometimes I think about those 2 figures standing in the darkness, patient and calm, like they had done this before and would do it again. I think about the precision of those cuts, the deliberate patterns, and wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed that second night. Brandon still has the photos Jenna took of the guys in the boat, and Claire kept all her documentation, but we never did anything with them. We found out later that Silver Pine Lake was temporarily closed for maintenance 2 weeks after our trip, though I wonder if that was really the reason. None of us have been camping since. Saturday night changed everything for me, and honestly, I'm hoping someone here might have gone through something similar because I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I'm a 28-year-old park ranger in Montana, and I've been doing night hikes for years. It's part of my job to know these trails like the back of my hand. That night, I was out with my 2 buddies, Ryan and Steve, on what should have been a routine 3-hour loop through Glacier Ridge Trail. We'd started around 9 p.m., each of us equipped with headlamps, backup flashlights, and enough gear to handle any normal situation. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light through the pine trees, and the temperature was perfect for hiking, cool enough to keep you moving but not so cold that you'd need heavy layers. Everything seemed normal, even peaceful, as we made our way up the initial incline, joking about Steve's new girlfriend and Ryan's terrible taste in music. About an hour into the hike, we reached the steepest part of the trail, where the path narrows and winds between massive boulders that look like ancient sentinels in the darkness. Ryan was leading, I was in the middle, and Steve was bringing up the rear. We always kept this formation because Steve had a habit of stopping to examine random plants or rocks, and this way we wouldn't lose him. The sound of our boots crunching on the gravelly path created a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, punctuated by the occasional crack of a branch or the distant call of an owl. But then I realized that rhythm was off. Instead of 3 sets of footsteps, I was only hearing 2. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see Steve right behind me, maybe bent over looking at something with his flashlight. But there was nothing except the empty trail stretching back into the darkness, my headlamp beam catching only the dust particles we'd kicked up. "Ryan, hold up!" I called out, and heard his footsteps stop ahead of me. "Steve's not behind us." Ryan came back down the trail, his headlamp bobbing with each step, and we both stood there scanning the path with our lights. The trail behind us was completely empty. No Steve, no movement, nothing. We started calling his name, our voices echoing off the rock faces around us, but the only response was our own voices bouncing back. Ryan pulled out his phone to call Steve, but of course there was no signal this deep in the mountains. We figured he must have stopped to take a leak or wandered off the trail to check something out. Typical Steve behavior, really. We decided to backtrack, keeping our lights trained on both sides of the trail, calling his name every few seconds. The forest had gone eerily quiet. Even the usual nighttime sounds of small animals rustling through the underbrush had stopped. After about 5 minutes of walking back the way we came, Ryan grabbed my arm and pointed his light at the ground. There, clear as day in the dirt, were Steve's footprints. I recognized the distinctive waffle pattern of his hiking boots, the ones he'd bought just a week ago and wouldn't shut up about. The prints were fresh, the edges still crisp in the loose soil, and they were heading in the same direction we'd been walking. We followed them carefully, our lights focused on the ground, tracking each step. But then, right in the middle of the trail, the footprints just stopped. Not at the edge of the path, not near a rock or tree he could have climbed, but right there in the center of the trail. The last print was perfect, complete, as if he'd taken one more step and then simply ceased to exist. Beyond that point, the dirt was undisturbed, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had been there at all. Ryan and I stood there staring at those footprints for what felt like forever, our minds trying to process what we were seeing. I got down on my knees and examined the area around the last print, running my fingers through the dirt, checking for any disturbance we might have missed. The soil was loose and would have shown any kind of movement. If Steve had jumped, we'd see the impact. If he'd been grabbed, there'd be scuff marks. Ryan started checking the trees on both sides of the trail with his flashlight, thinking maybe Steve had somehow climbed up, but the nearest branches were at least 15 feet high, and there were no marks on the bark. We expanded our search area, moving in widening circles from that last footprint, our lights sweeping through the underbrush and between the boulders. Every shadow looked like it could be Steve crouching or lying down, but each time we investigated, we found nothing but rocks and vegetation. The rational part of my brain kept insisting there had to be a logical explanation. People don't just vanish into thin air. Maybe Steve had carefully stepped backward in his own prints as some kind of stupid prank, though that didn't seem like him at all. Or perhaps there was a hidden crevice or cave entrance we couldn't see in the darkness. But the more we searched, the more wrong everything felt. Ryan suddenly pointed out something I hadn't noticed before. About 10 feet past where Steve's prints ended, our own footprints from earlier continued on, undisturbed. Mine, Ryan's, and Steve's, all 3 sets walking in formation just like we had been. Except Steve himself was gone, and his tracks showed him walking back toward us before stopping. My chest got tight as I tried to wrap my head around the impossibility of it. How could his prints from an hour ago still be there ahead of us, while he had somehow walked back and disappeared without leaving any other trace? We spent the next hour searching every inch of that area, our voices getting hoarse from calling Steve's name. Ryan even climbed up on some of the larger boulders to get a better view, shining his light down into the gaps between them. I remember the way the shadows danced and shifted with our moving lights, making every dark space look like it could be hiding something. At one point, I thought I heard Steve's voice calling back to us from somewhere up the trail. But when we stopped to listen, there was only the wind moving through the pines. Ryan heard it too, though. We both turned toward the same direction at the exact same moment. We practically ran up the trail, following the sound, our boots slipping on the loose gravel in our haste. But when we got to where we thought the voice had come from, there was nothing. Just more empty trail winding up the mountain. The worst part was that we found another set of Steve's fresh footprints there, maybe 50 yards from where the first set had ended, but these ones only went for about 10 steps before they too stopped dead in the middle of the path. My mind was racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. I'd heard stories from other rangers about people getting disoriented on trails, but this was different. Steve's gear was top-notch. He knew these mountains, and there was no way he could move between those two spots without leaving tracks in between. Ryan suggested we head back to the parking area, thinking maybe Steve had somehow gotten past us and gone back to the car. But as we turned to go back, we both heard it clearly this time. Steve's distinctive laugh, that weird snorting sound he made when something really amused him. It came from above us, somewhere in the canopy of trees. We pointed our lights up, scanning every branch, every shadow among the pine needles. The beam of my flashlight caught something pale about 30 feet up. It was Steve's backpack, hanging from a branch, swaying slightly in the breeze. The pack was completely intact, zipped up, with his water bottle still clipped to the side. There was no way it could have been thrown that high, and the tree trunk showed no signs of anyone having climbed it. Ryan and I stood there, necks craned upward, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The backpack just hung there, occasionally spinning slowly when the wind caught it, like some kind of twisted ornament. Ryan tried to climb the tree, but the lowest branches were too high and the trunk was too thick to shimmy up. We briefly considered trying to knock it down with rocks, but something about the whole situation made us hesitate. It felt like disturbing evidence, though evidence of what, I couldn't say. That's when we noticed something else that made our situation even more bizarre. Our phones, which had shown no signal earlier, were now displaying full bars. Ryan immediately tried calling Steve's phone and we could hear it ringing. The sound was coming from inside the hanging backpack, the screen's glow faintly visible through the fabric in the darkness. But when the call connected, all we heard was breathing, slow and deliberate, definitely human but somehow wrong. Not Steve's breathing pattern. I'd shared enough tense with him to know how he sounded. This was deeper, more measured, like someone consciously controlling each breath. "Steve, if this is a joke, it's not funny anymore," Ryan said into his phone, his voice cracking slightly. The breathing continued for a few more seconds. Then the line went dead. We tried calling back immediately, but now the phone went straight to voicemail. That's when things got truly terrifying. We started hearing footsteps circling us, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth. But every time we pointed our lights toward the sound, there was nothing there. The footsteps would stop when we looked, then start again from a different direction the moment we turned away. They were getting closer, tightening the circle around us. Ryan and I stood back to back, our lights sweeping the forest, and that's when I saw him, or what I thought was him. Steve was standing about 20 feet away, just at the edge of our light's reach, but something was horribly wrong with how he was positioned. His body was turned away from us, but his head was twisted around at an impossible angle, looking directly at us with eyes that reflected our lights like an animal's. Before we could react, he turned and walked backward into the darkness, his head still facing us, moving in a way that human bodies simply shouldn't be able to move. Ryan and I didn't need to discuss what to do next. We ran. We ran faster than I've ever run in my life, our feet pounding down the trail, branches whipping at our faces, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, we could hear those footsteps keeping pace, sometimes sounding like they were right on our heels, other times echoing from the sides of the trail. At one point, Ryan tripped over a root and went down hard, and when I helped him up, I saw Steve again. This time, he was crouched on a boulder above us like some kind of gargoyle, his limbs bent at weird angles, watching us with those reflecting eyes. But it couldn't have been Steve. because at the exact same moment, we heard Steve's actual voice calling for help from somewhere behind us, desperate and terrified. The thing on the boulder tilted its head at the sound, then scuttled away into the darkness with movements that reminded me more of an insect than a person. We kept running, ignoring the cries for help that kept changing location. Sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes right beside us in the trees. We made it back to the parking area in less than half the time it should have taken, our legs shaking, our clothes soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. Ryan's car was still there, and so was Steve's truck, sitting exactly where he'd parked it. The doors were locked, his keys presumably in the backpack still hanging from that tree. We got in Ryan's car and locked the doors, trying to catch our breath and figure out what to do. That's when we saw the figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, just outside the reach of the overhead light. It looked like Steve, but he was standing completely still, arms at his sides facing our direction. We sat there for maybe 5 minutes watching this thing that looked like our friend but couldn't be, until finally Ryan started the engine. As we pulled out, our headlights swept across the figure, and for just a second, I saw its face clearly. It had Steve's features, but the expression was blank, empty, like someone had made a decent copy but forgot to add the humanity. We drove straight to the police station and reported Steve missing. They found his backpack the next morning, on the ground near the trail, all his belongings intact. They never found Steve, though they searched for 2 weeks. Ryan and I went back once with the search team in daylight, and there were no unusual footprints, no signs of the bizarre things we'd seen. The official report lists it as a probable wildlife encounter, suggesting Steve got disoriented and wandered off the trail. Ryan and I don't hike together anymore. We barely talk about that night, but I know he still has nightmares about it because I do too. Sometimes I wake up thinking I hear Steve's voice calling for help, and I have to remind myself that whatever we saw in those woods, whatever was wearing Steve's face, that wasn't really him. The smell of campfire smoke still makes me nauseous. Every time I catch a whiff of it, at a backyard barbecue from a neighbor's chimney, my whole body tenses up and I'm right back at that campsite in Redwood National Park. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, just me and the giant trees for 4 days in early June. I'd driven 6 hours from San Francisco in my old Ford Ranger, the truck bed loaded with way too much gear for one person. The divorce papers had been finalized 2 weeks earlier, and staring at code all day wasn't helping me process any of it. I needed silence, real silence, the kind you only get when you're miles away from cell towers and traffic. The park ranger at the entrance barely looked up when I signed in, just reminded me about proper food storage and handed me a backcountry permit for Section 7, one of the more remote areas. The hike to my chosen spot took about 40 minutes, following a narrow trail that wound between trees so massive they made me feel like an ant. I picked a clearing near a small creek, one of those designated camping areas with a metal fire ring and a flat patch of dirt worn smooth by countless tents. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in these long golden beams that made everything look like a nature documentary. While I was setting up my bright orange tent, the same one my ex-wife used to complain was aggressively visible, I kept hearing these little sounds in the forest. Normal stuff, birds and squirrels, branches creaking in the breeze. By the time I had my camp stove going and was boiling water for dinner, the sun was getting low. That's when I spotted the smoke rising through the trees, maybe 200 yards away. Another fire pit, 3 figures moving around it. They weren't making any noise, which seemed odd since most campers are pretty chatty once they've settled in for the evening. I tried to get a better look while I ate my rehydrated pasta, squinting through the trees as darkness crept in. 2 men and a woman, from what I could tell. They had this weird way of moving around their fire, deliberate, almost choreographed, like they were following some kind of pattern. No tents that I could see, just the 3 of them standing there. The woman had long hair that caught the firelight when she turned, and one of the men was tall, really tall, maybe 6'5" or more. The shorter guy kept pacing in this tight circle, clockwise, always clockwise. I told myself they were probably just day hikers who'd stayed too late and were warming up before heading back to the parking area. But they had no backpacks, no gear at all that I could spot. Just regular clothes, jeans and dark jackets. Not exactly standard hiking attire. Around 9 o'clock, I was settling into my sleeping bag with a book when I heard footsteps outside my tent. Not the random rustling of animals, but measured, careful steps on the pine needles and dried leaves. I clicked off my headlamp and listened. The footsteps circled my entire campsite, pausing every few feet. Through the mesh window of my tent, I could barely make out a shape against the dying embers of my fire. It was the tall one from the other campsite. He stood there for what must have been 5 minutes, completely still, just facing my tent. I held my breath, trying to figure out what to do. Call out? Pretend to be asleep? Grab my knife? Then he turned and walked back toward the trees, not hurried, not sneaking, just walking like he'd been out for an evening stroll. I watched his silhouette merge with the darkness between the redwoods. I didn't sleep after that. Every sound became a threat. The creek gurgling, wind through branches, even my own sleeping bag rustling when I shifted position. I kept the knife unfolded next to my pillow and checked my phone obsessively, even though I had no signal. Around midnight, I heard them talking. Not words exactly, but these low, rhythmic sounds that carried through the forest. It wasn't any language I recognized, more like a chant or maybe even humming, but deeper and more guttural. The sound would rise and fall in waves, sometimes getting loud enough that it seemed like they were right outside, then fading until I wondered if I was imagining it. At one point, I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. Their fire was blazing now, much bigger than before, throwing wild shadows against the trees. I counted 5 people around it instead of 3. The worst part came around 2 in the morning. The chanting had stopped maybe 20 minutes earlier, and the forest had gone completely quiet. No insects, no birds, nothing. Then I heard my name. Clear as day, someone called out Daniel from the direction of their camp. Not shouting, just speaking it normally, like they were having a conversation. The thing is, I hadn't told anyone in the park my name. I'd signed the register as D. Coleman, and I hadn't talked to a single person since arriving. They called it out 3 more times, spacing it out every few minutes. Daniel. Pause. Daniel. Each time in that same conversational tone, like they were checking if I was awake. My whole body was rigid with fear, and I was gripping the knife so hard my knuckles ached. Part of me wanted to pack up right then and hike out in the dark, but the thought of walking past their camp to reach the trail made that impossible. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I must have dozed off, because I woke up to sunlight filtering through my tent. It was maybe 6:30, and for a brief moment I thought I'd dreamed the whole thing. Then I unzipped my tent and saw my backpack. I'd left it hanging from a tree branch about 10 feet away, standard practice to keep animals from getting curious. But now it was on the ground, contents scattered everywhere. My water filter, first aid kit, and food were arranged in a perfect circle around the base of the tree. My clothes were folded into neat little squares and stacked like a pyramid. Even my socks were paired and lined up by color. But the really disturbing part was my wallet. Every single card had been removed and planted in the dirt like little tombstones, all facing my tent. My driver's license was front and center, and behind it my credit cards, insurance card, even my library card, all standing upright in perfect rows. I started throwing everything back into my pack, not caring about organization, just wanting to get out of there. That's when I noticed the other thing, footprints everywhere around my campsite, dozens of them, overlapping, circling. They'd walked around my tent all night over and over. Some of the prints were bare feet, which made no sense given how cold it got. As I was cramming my sleeping bag into its stuff sack, I glanced toward where their camp had been. Nothing. No sign anyone had been there at all. The fire pit looked like it hadn't been used in weeks, full of old leaves and pine needles. I actually walked over to check, thinking maybe I'd gotten turned around, but it was definitely the same spot. The logs they'd been sitting on were covered in undisturbed moss. Even the ground where I'd seen them standing showed no signs of footprints, no disturbance at all. The hike back to my truck took less than 30 minutes. I practically ran most of the way. My pack bounced against my back, half-zipped, with random gear poking out. Every shadow between the trees made me flinch. Every bird call made me walk faster. When I finally burst out of the tree line into the parking area, there were 2 other cars there besides mine. A young couple was just arriving, pulling on their backpacks and chatting about which trail to take. They gave me weird looks, and I realized I probably looked insane. Sweaty, wild-eyed, practically sprinting out of the forest at 7 in the morning. I threw my pack in the truck bed and fumbled for my keys. As I was backing out, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. There was a piece of paper under my windshield wiper. My hands shook as I got out to grab it. It was a receipt from a gas station in Eureka, dated 3 days ago with my credit card number on it. The same card that had been stuck in the ground at my campsite. The signature line had Daniel written in handwriting that wasn't mine. I'd never been to Eureka. I was in San Francisco 3 days ago and I had the receipts to prove it. But when I checked my phone once I got signal, there it was in my banking app, a charge for $47.83 at a Shell station in Eureka. I called the credit card company right there in the parking lot. But what was I going to say? That someone used my card while it was physically in my possession? The woman on the phone pulled up more charges. A motel in Crescent City, a diner in McKinleyville, all from the past week. All signed with my name but not my handwriting. The amounts were small, nothing that would trigger a fraud alert. She asked if I wanted to dispute them, and I said yes, but I knew how crazy it would sound. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced I'd see that tall figure standing on the side of the road, or those 3 people in another car following me. At every red light, I'd look at the cars around me, searching faces, wondering if they were watching. When I finally got back to my apartment in San Francisco, I deadbolted the door and didn't leave for 2 days. I called in sick to work, ordered groceries online, and spent hours Googling things like suspicious camping encounters and credit card fraud while camping. Nothing matched what happened to me. On the 3rd day, a package arrived that I hadn't ordered. Inside was a Forest Service map of Redwood National Park. Someone had drawn red circles around 7 different camping areas, including the one I'd stayed at. Each circle had a date written next to it. Mine had the correct date. The other 6 were all from the past 2 months. At the bottom of the map, someone had written, "Thanks for visiting," in the same handwriting from the gas station receipt. I did something I'm not proud of. I researched those other dates. Local news, missing person reports, anything I could find. 4 of the 6 dates matched up with missing hiker reports. People who went camping alone and just vanished. Their cars found in parking areas. Their campsites discovered days later with everything neatly arranged but no sign of them. The Park Service blamed it on inexperienced hikers getting lost, wildlife, the usual explanations. But I knew better. Those people at the fire pit, whatever they weren't regular campers. They were something else entirely, and they're still out there. I reported everything to the Park Service and the police, but without evidence. The footprints were just footprints. The receipt could have been a mistake. There was nothing they could do. I still have that map. Sometimes I think about the 2 dates that didn't match any missing persons reports. Maybe those people never reported what happened. Maybe they're like me, sitting in their apartments, trying to convince themselves it was all some elaborate prank while knowing deep down it wasn't. I remember that trip clearly because it was supposed to be one of the most relaxing weekends I'd had in a long time. My girlfriend at the time, Emily, had been pushing for a quiet getaway into the woods. We'd both been under pressure at work and figured a couple of nights camping by a small lake would help us reset. I wasn't an experienced outdoorsman, but Emily loved hiking, and she convinced me that being unplugged would do me some good. We packed light, just the tent, a small cooler, and the kind of gear you'd expect from people who weren't exactly survivalists. Our campsite was in a clearing that looked almost staged, like someone had chosen it years ago and kept it hidden from the world. There was enough space for our tent, a ring of stones for a fire pit, and tall pines that surrounded us in a neat semicircle. Beyond the trees, the trail cut deeper into the forest, its dirt path worn but not wide enough for anything larger than a person to walk through. It felt private, safe, even cozy in a strange way. We set up camp in the late afternoon and spent that first night cooking over the fire and listening to the silence broken only by crickets and the occasional splash from the lake. The next morning started calm. Emily wanted to hike farther down the trail to see if it connected to another part of the lake. I wasn't against it, but I moved slower than she did, and she teased me for stopping every few minutes to take in random details. The moss on fallen logs, a bird perched so still it looked fake. About 20 minutes in, though, I noticed something that didn't look like it belonged there. A small cluster of bones, pale against the dark soil. They weren't scattered the way you'd expect if an animal had been torn apart. They were lined up neatly, pointing in the same direction. At first, I thought Emily had seen it too, but she was a few steps ahead, humming to herself. I called her back, and when she crouched beside me, her expression shifted from curiosity to unease almost instantly. The bones looked like they had been arranged deliberately, each one small, maybe from a rabbit or raccoon, set end to end like a primitive arrow. Emily didn't say much, but I could tell she was unsettled. She suggested we keep walking a bit farther, see if it was just some random oddity left by another hiker. Against my better judgment, I agreed, and we followed the strange arrow deeper into the trail. The farther we went, the more unnerving it became. Every few yards, another cluster of bones appeared, sometimes just 2 or 3, other times a longer line like someone had carefully placed them there hours before. They weren't decayed or buried in leaves. They were stark, fresh-looking, like they'd been bleached in the sun, even though this trail barely got any light through the canopy. The arrangement started to feel purposeful, not random, as if someone was guiding us, or warning us. Emily stopped joking around completely. She kept glancing back toward the campsite even while walking forward. Eventually, the trail of bones shifted direction, curving slightly off the main path. That was the moment Emily insisted we turn back. She muttered something about not wanting to end up in someone's twisted idea of art. We retraced our steps, but the strange thing was that from this angle, the bones looked like they pointed the opposite way, back toward where we had set up our tent. I remember standing there trying to laugh it off, but the idea sank in. Whoever had arranged them hadn't wanted hikers to wander deeper. They'd arranged them to lead directly to us. By the time we got back to the clearing, the sun was already dropping lower, staining the sky in shades of red that made the woods feel heavier and more suffocating. Our tent looked ordinary enough, but the silence pressing down on that little clearing was different now. I half expected to see another line of bones waiting for us, but nothing jumped out at first glance. Emily grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do you see that?" I followed her gaze and noticed a small, pale shape just outside the fire ring. A single bone, clean and deliberate, lying where we hadn't seen one before. We hadn't left the camp unattended for more than an hour, and there hadn't been another soul on that trail. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but Emily thought maybe someone local was just messing with us, some weird prank to scare campers. I couldn't argue, but the pit in my chest kept growing. As night crept in, every crack of a branch or rustle in the brush sent us spinning around with the weak beam of my flashlight. The forest no longer felt quiet. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to notice whatever was coming next. That night was one of the longest I've ever lived through. The fire burned low, and every time I tried to add more wood, I swore I could hear footsteps in the brush, retreating as soon as I turned my head. Emily kept whispering that we should leave, but the thought of hiking the narrow trail in pitch black was even worse. We decided to wait until first light. Sleep was out of the question. We sat in silence, clutching the flashlight and listening to the forest breathe around us. When dawn finally broke, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. The forest looked harmless again, just trees and mist rolling off the lake. But then Emily gasped. Just a few feet from our tent, along the edge of the clearing, there was another line of bones. This time it was longer, more deliberate, snaking from the tree line straight toward where we had slept. Whoever or whatever had been leaving them had done it while we were awake, while we were staring into the dark, convinced we were alone. We packed in a rush. I barely cared if we left things behind. I just wanted out. The trail back to the car felt endless, but what shook me the most was realizing that the bones weren't only behind us anymore. As we walked, we noticed fresh ones ahead too, laid out as if predicting our path before we took it. I didn't want to say it out loud, but it felt like someone had been watching us the entire time, mapping every step we took. By the time we reached the parking lot, I couldn't get the gear into the trunk fast enough. We never went back to that lake. In fact, I haven't camped since. Emily and I eventually broke up, but sometimes we still talk, and almost every conversation drifts back to that weekend. We can't explain how anyone could have gotten so close without us hearing, or why they wanted to mark our movements with those bones. The only thing I know for sure is that someone out there wanted us to find them, and they wanted us to understand we'd been followed all along. I'd been planning that weekend with my younger brother, Daniel, for weeks. Life was stressful back then, and getting away into the woods seemed like the perfect reset. We packed light, just a small tent, a cooler, and some fishing gear. Nothing fancy, just enough to feel like we were stepping out of routine. The drive took us down back roads that narrowed into a dirt trail lined with towering pines that blocked out most of the daylight. By the time we found a clearing large enough to set up camp, the silence around us was already heavier than I expected. Daniel joked it felt like the trees were keeping secrets. Not far from where we pitched the tent, maybe a few hundred feet deeper into the trees, something metallic caught the sunlight. It looked like a dull glimmer at first, but when we walked closer, we realized it was an old van, half swallowed by brush and pine needles. The paint was more rust than color, the windows darkened with grime. Its tires were flat, one of them buried in the dirt as if it hadn't moved in years. There was no path leading to it, which made me wonder how it even got there in the first place. Daniel wanted to check inside, but the doors were locked and the handle snapped back with a stubborn click when he tugged on it. The whole thing unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Vehicles abandoned in the woods usually had a story, and not the good kind. My mind went to missing person cases I'd read about. People who vanished in remote areas, their belongings found months or years later. Daniel shrugged it off, saying it was just some hunter's junk that got left behind. But the van's presence gnawed at me. It wasn't just the way it was hidden. It felt deliberately tucked out of sight, as though someone hadn't wanted it found. That night, we built a fire and tried to distract ourselves with food and stories. But I kept glancing toward the tree line where we'd seen the van. The forest was dense enough that I couldn't make it out anymore, yet I felt its presence sitting out there, like a guest we hadn't invited. Daniel teased me for being jumpy and I laughed it off, though I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. When the crickets died down and the fire burned low, the silence pressed in so hard that every crack of a twig sounded amplified. Then, out of nowhere, two beams of light cut through the trees. Headlights, bright and unwavering, pointed straight into our campsite. Daniel jumped up first, shielding his eyes against the sudden brightness, while I sat frozen on the log we'd been using as a bench. The van was impossible to see through the glare, but I knew those lights were coming from exactly where it had been sitting. My first thought was that someone must have been inside it the entire time we'd been out here. That possibility hit me harder than anything supernatural, someone watching us for hours, waiting until it was dark enough to make themselves known. The air felt heavier, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I grabbed the hatchet we'd brought for splitting wood, though it felt ridiculously small in my hands. Daniel whispered, asking if we should yell or shine our flashlight back, but I couldn't answer. All I could think about was how silent it was around us. No engine hum, no crunch of tires, nothing but those blinding beams cutting across the trees. They didn't flicker, didn't move, just stayed locked on us. I finally muttered that we should get into the tent, but the idea of hiding in thin nylon made me feel exposed, like prey under a spotlight. Minutes dragged out, each one stretched so thin it felt like an hour. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the smoke curled through the light in pale ribbons. Daniel tried shouting, his voice cracking when he demanded to know who was out there. No reply. The lights didn't blink. My heart pounded so loudly it almost drowned out the quiet, and every instinct screamed to leave, but the trail back to the car was pitch black, and I couldn't shake the image of someone waiting along it. We stayed rooted there, caught between fight and flight, with no good option. Then, as suddenly as they'd flared on, the headlights cut out. The darkness slammed back around us, thicker than before, and I realized just how deep into the woods we really were. Daniel swore under his breath and fumbled for the flashlight, sweeping the beam through the trees, but there was nothing. No van, no sound of movement, just rows of pines standing like silent witnesses. The space where the lights had been shining looked empty, too empty, as though the forest itself had swallowed the van whole. Neither of us slept much after that. Every sound carried through the trees, an owl calling, branches creaking, and each one felt like proof that someone was still out there, just beyond the circle of our light. Daniel wanted to pack up and leave right then, but hiking back through the forest at night felt like walking straight into a trap. We ended up sitting with our backs to each other, scanning in opposite directions until the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. That faint glow was the first time all night I felt like the world hadn't caved in on us. When daylight finally spread through the clearing, the woods looked almost ordinary again, but the unease never lifted. We went straight to where the van had been, expecting to see it exactly as before. Rusted, swallowed by vines, lifeless, only it wasn't there anymore. The patch of ground was disturbed, pine needles pushed aside, and deep tracks cut through the dirt like someone had forced the thing back into motion overnight. I stared at those tire marks until my throat tightened, because I knew we hadn't heard an engine or anything move. It shouldn't have been possible. We didn't bother cooking breakfast. We shoved everything into the trunk and left in silence, neither of us wanting to be the first to admit how badly that night had shaken us. The whole drive back, Daniel kept glancing in the rearview mirror like he half expected to see headlights following us. I wanted to reassure him, but my mind kept circling back to the same thought. If that van had been abandoned for years, then who had been inside? And why wait until the dead of night to make their presence known? It's been years since that trip, and I still think about those headlights. They weren't just beams cutting through the trees. They felt aimed at us with intention, like we'd been chosen to see them. I've camped a few times since, but never in that area, and never without remembering the glow of those lights pinning us in place. People laugh when I mention it, chalking it up to some backwoods drifter messing around. Maybe they're right. But sometimes late at night when a car passes my house and its headlights sweep across my window, I'm right back in those pines, staring into that blinding glow, wondering who or what was watching us.